I ask myself the question, what does it mean not just to talk about this book, but to talk about any of our literary endeavor, what we have written, what we are reading? Because the only tenuous connection I can find is that in writing, I have become the tide, and the novel itself, once it is sort of leaving you, was obsessed with ways of expressing and exploring inequality and imagining utopia.
Hello and welcome to Gulplok. I am Antara Chakrabarti and today we meet again for another episode of Bookmarked, where we are going to discuss a very engaging read entitled I Have Become the Tide, authored by Githa Hariharan, which was published in the year 2019 by Simon & Schuster. The paperback version of the book has come out very recently in 2021. Before I go ahead to give an overview of the book, I would like to introduce you all to our esteemed panelists that we have with us today. We have with us our very first panelist, Ritu Menon, who is one of the very few and accomplished feminist publishers from South Asia and writer, co-founder of Kali for Women, Asia's first feminist press. She has been active in the women's movement in India, across South Asia, and internationally for over 25 years, and has written and published widely on gender issues over the last 3 decades. She is on the boards of various national and international organizations and has been awarded the Padma Shri by the Government of India in 2011. We have with us Ranjit Hoskote, Indian poet, art critic, cultural theorist, and an independent curator. He is a seminal voice in the contemporary cultural landscape of India. He has authored more than 30 books across poetry, art criticism, cultural theory, and translation. And not to mention, has been honored with Sahitya Akademi Golden Jubilee Award for Literature in 2004 and Raza Award for Literature in 2006. His latest book, The Atlas of Lost Beliefs, which is the UK edition of Jona Wale, has been published by ARC in the UK and has won a Poetry Book Society recommendation for summer 2020. Next, we have with us Sudhanva Deshpande, who is a theatre director and an actor. He joined Jananatya Manch in 1987 and has acted over 4,000 performances of over 80 plays. His articles and essays have appeared in various newspapers, weeklies, and many other publications. He has held teaching positions at the National Institute of Design, Jamia Millia Islamia, and since 1998, he has been the managing editor of Leftward Books. Not to mention, we have with us our author, very own author, Gita Hariharan, and we are going to discuss Gita Hariharan's novel today. But before that, I would like to just give a brief, broad stroke of what the book has been about. Gita Hariharan's novel brings together three perspectives intertwined across time and space. The first is of Dr. Krishna, a poetry professor who theorized that Kanna Deva, the poet's saint, may have come from the lower castes. In the story's second strand, Satya, Asha, and Ravi are modern-day Dalits representing the dark sides of affirmative action in education. The story's third strand details the life of Chikkiah and Mahadevi, who have escaped their village, where they were forced to do certain menial jobs just because of their castes. They raised their son Kannadeva in Anandagrama, a community where caste doesn't determine the kind of jobs a person is allowed to do. Now, with this broad stroke of the book, I wouldn't like to take much more time and invite our first panelist, Ranjit Hoskote, to take us through his experience.
Thank you so much for your introduction. And it's really a pleasure to be in this space of samvad, as I think of it, with Ritu and Sudhanva and Gita herself, whose work is the focus of our conversation this evening. You know, when the book came to me first, I have to say that it, in the conventional phrase, blew me away for these reasons. It struck me as being a marvelous engagement with questions and crises that were exceedingly current, our urgencies, and yet at no point did you feel that the book degenerated into some kind of cardboard cutout novel of ideas. So it's, from my point of view, it's a tremendous achievement to be able to deal with these social and cultural and political urgencies whilst yet functioning as a narrative that grips you, that engages at the level of affect. So I want to just address various points that have really remained with me in the several years that have gone by since I read it, and then I of course reread it now to prepare for this evening. And I'll also say a little bit about why I responded as I did, specifically because at the heart of this novel by Githa Hariharan is a text, is a contested text. And it seems to me that that is one of the premier tropes of our time. It bears the signature of a saint poet who has been venerated and sanctified by orthodoxy. But the contents of this text, this manuscript, point to its heterodox origins. And in this sense, it really plays out a very major cultural mechanism that characterizes India. We've seen this happen over and over again. The rise of dissident, if you will, Protestant movements that take on orthodoxies of caste, gender, ethnicity, and so on, but which in due course become reabsorbed by Brahmanism, for lack of another term. So what you see, Antara, as you sketched out the structure of the novel, what strikes me is not that they're three different narratives or that they're in any kind of succession, but what excites me is the way in which they evolve, they intersect, they reflect and refract across time. So there's an incredible temporal play that goes on among these three narratives. So on the one hand, there's Chikkiah and Mahadevi. Chikkiah and Mahadevi have both overcome the limitations and constraints of their caste origins, and they've become part of this dissident utopia, Anandagrama, which eventually comes to a sad end because it's destroyed, as we all know as readers of the novel. Then there's the story of their son Kannappa, who makes his journey towards a certain kind of orthodox acceptance through a certain silence. What strikes me about this character is the fact that he is tacit in his complicity with those who see him as a wise man, a teacher, a guide. He doesn't actively point out who he is. When he is among his own birth community, he doesn't particularly draw attention to who he is. And we are also familiar with this kind of figure. And I'm not going to sit in judgment and say that this is a figure who conceals his origins in any way. This is also a set of strategies that people in this position have evolved over time in order to make their way in a world that is so heavily loaded against them. And then in the determinate present, you have the researcher, Professor Krishna, and his three students, all of Dalit heritage, all bearing powerfully symbolic names: Asha, hope; Ravi, the sun; Satya, the truth. Names resonant with possibility and yet also under threat. And it's the way in which these narratives mirror and, as I say, reflect and refract each other that engages my readerly attention. All the more so because I've spent a number of years translating and editing and commenting on the 14th century Kashmiri mystic poet Lal Ded. And in the 20 and more years that I spent on this project, which really was more like a life commitment, not a mechanical project, I came up against many of these same questions. There is, on the one hand, the interplay between an original voice, and then there is the transmission line along which there are anonymous contributors, and I characterize these as a contributory lineage. There are voices, there are people, men, women, pundits, Muslims, peasants, scholars, who've all contributed to this corpus of Lala's works under the signature of the original, but bringing their own life experiences, their own consciousness and sensibility to the composition. And I see that happening in this book as well, in the text that lies at the heart of Gita's novel. I see, again, a point of contact and affinity, because Lala has existed historically for centuries in multiple versions. She's been Laleshwari to Hindus. She's been Lala Rifa to Muslims. There's been no contradiction until now, until the last 25 or 30 years, when in a highly polarized and politicized situation, every element of Kashmiri heritage, including Lalla, has been torn apart. So there's an incredible polarization that you now see in how claims are made to the mantle of Lalla, if you will. And I see that this is where Karnappa, Karnadeva occupies the same kind of ground of contestation. And then there's, of course, something that as a scholar is of great interest to me, which is the transmission of texts from the oral to the scribal to print. And the way in which this is not a simple linearity, as all of us here know. There are also unexpected feedbacks and loops. Things printed find their way back into a so-called oral tradition that precedes them. Scribal material goes back into oral performance. So the idea that the oral precedes the scribal and the print is not always tenable. And I find all of these exciting possibilities alluded. Forgive me for getting very excited about something seemingly as dry and boring as the transmission line of a text. But I find all these possibilities imminent in Gita's novel, and the way in which each one of these acts, far from being dry and academic, actually compels people to mobilize in favor of or against, in antagonism or in communion. So texts are not dead things. On the contrary, they compel us and summon us to our life world, whether in a positive or a negative kind of way. And I feel I should, at this point, if you'll indulge me, read what to me is one of the most moving passages in the book. It's on page 289. It's when Karnadeva recognizes that he has to acknowledge the Karnappa he was and his people. And I quote, Karnadeva gets up, approaches the open box, dips his hand into it. He sets aside the green cloth and the bracelet tenderly. Let their stories end with him. But the drum, Chikkiah's drum, the drum Chikkiah told them belonged to his father. Chikkiah never told them his name. Karnadeva knows him only as the unseen grandfather who skinned carcasses, drank and sang songs, one song in particular, to his faithful drum. Let this drum be the witness. Karnadeva will make sure those voices, the words and lines that rang so simple, hard, and true are never forgotten. And then I skip a little. By the light of the lamp, late at night, every night for the next several weeks, he works hard, copying one poem after another. At the bottom of each, he meticulously records the name of the author. Chikkiah, Mahadevi, Puttanna, wise Prabhu, grandfather. He also adds the name of the copier. I skip again. He looks at the originals once more. He finds his mother's compositions and memories. There's Mahadevi's large, wandering miracle of a collection. The leaves are a faint yellow and just 8 inches long, the cheap, brittle kind given to students for copy work. How childish his mother's script, how many holes and splotches and falls in between, and how prodigious her memory, how tenacious her intent. These leaves of love must be there too. He intersperses the originals with his copies. He collates. Then he makes holes in the margin of each leaf. He passes silken thread through the holes and ties the leaves carefully. And so it is that he bears witness in this editorial work to all of the many lives that have gone into his own life and his own trajectory. And it's this desire to bear witness to these many lives that have gone into our own palimpsestual cultural history, many of which have been repressed for reason of gender or caste or ethnicity or language. This, to me, is what makes this novel so incredibly central and important to our discussions today, because we're living at a time when plurality of narrative is looked upon with great suspicion. We're all being asked to subscribe to some single, flat, monolithic narrative, which is brutally suspicious of difference, of dissidence. And what this novel does really is to remind us of this lineage of dissident utopias that we can draw on. I was struck, even the first time I read it, by the way in which it has certain affinities with an academic work, Gail Lomvit's Begumpura. And I found myself shuttling in my mind between these texts and thinking back again at how generation after generation we have to resist the ways in which these dissident utopias, these heterotopias, if you will, get reabsorbed into a mainstream that has no patience with everything that is unruly and transgressive about them. So, in effect, what Gita's novel does is to ask us to reach back into resources of hope on the basis of which we can shape new solidarities.
Thank you so much, Ranjit Hoskote. I was really intrigued with the points where you said or pointed out how there are pluralities of life worlds, yet we are demanded to limit ourselves to the mainstream ideas. So, not wasting much time, I would like to invite our next panelist, Ritu Menon, to take over and take us through her experience with the
Thank you, Antara, and lovely to be here with Gita, Ranjit, Sudhu, all friends, all readers, and all I would say writers, as you mentioned when you introduced us. So, like Ranjit, of course, I read the novel when it was in proofs, and then read it again. Actually, read it when it was before proofs. Then, of course, reread it now again. And what I'm going to say actually is sort of in a funny way, in an uncanny way, dovetails with what Ranjit said very eloquently, but in a slightly different idiom. I'm going to say, of course, it as you said, it is 3 strands, yes. So I call that 3-ply yarn. The novel really is 3-ply yarn. Because the stories are intertwined. You can't actually separate them. There's no way in which if you separated these 3 strands, you would get the novel. No, it would unravel. The yarn would unravel. So for me, that image is very sort of, is a very creative and a very organic one. And I don't know whether it was intended or not. I think, of course, that there are 3 strands, there are 3 perspectives. That's very clear. But I'm thinking of it in a much more organic way. So that's at that level. But what are these 3 strands? So it's not just the 3 different stories or the 3 different encounters, the 3 different sets of lives. What I read them as is there's allegory, which is the Kannadeva Kannappan part of the novel. There's what I call faction, which is a fictive use of very well documented facts, which is the 3 friends, Asha, Ravi, and Satya. That strand is the strand of fact rendered into fiction. And then there's the third device, which is a historical romance. Romance not in the Mills and Boon sense, but in the original sense of a romance, which is the Krishna story. So there are these 3 very distinct literary choices, or I could even call them genres, that have been used in a very skillful way. Now, it's a very difficult undertaking to use these 3 forms that normally call for 3 very distinctive narrative choices and techniques. The 3 forms do not always follow the same narrative choices or allow the same narrative choices. But Gita has done, I think, a very courageous thing by and large, using one voice, her voice, the authorial voice for all 3. Now, it works very well for most of the time, but at other times not so well, and I come to that later. So why 3 literary devices for a single work? I mean, it's not unknown, but it is uncommon. And I'm going to try and explain what I mean by posing 3 questions. One is, and this is a question that every writer has grappled with, how do you write violence? How? How in a literary work do you write violence? How are you to write the story of Asha, Ravi, and Satya? What do you do with it as a writer? You have all the material. Gita has drawn on documented factual material for those three stories. All three, we know them. We know Kalburgi, Dabolkar, Rohit Vemula, we know all that. That is her material. That is the factual material that has been transported into the novel. She has used what I would call a kind of reportage, meaning not in the sense of newspaper reports, but in the sense of almost just describing their lives. I was struck, for example, in the three friends, in the telling of their stories, why there is so little dialogue. Did these friends not talk to each other directly in direct speech? But through that whole narrative of the three friends, it is reported speech that we hear. There is very little of direct speech in their exchanges with each other. The direct speech is always in retrospect. This is very interesting. It's when Asha recalls her conversation, Ravi recalls his conversation, and Satya mainly in an interior kind of monologue. So it seems to me that this was the way in which she was able to write this violence, which, as we know, as Hannah Arendt has told us, the banality of it is what defeats the literary response. So I see this as a challenge. I mean, I did think that this was something that maybe she had to grapple with. The second is, how do you write evil? I mean, without being, literal and pedantic and I don't know what other word to use, but obvious. How do you write evil, which is actually the Krishna story? The evil that is lurking, that Ranjit spoke about, that brutal, deliberate, unconscionable, it's not even violence, it is evil. How do you do it? Well, I think she's done something remarkable because she has told it in the simplest, most beautiful way, which is she has counterpointed that evil that is out there in that scheming, amoral, immoral sort of exterior. She has counterpointed it with the loving family. That is to say, Krishna is surrounded always. Now, this is a romance tradition. This is what romance does. So here, I think that this has worked wonderfully well. Very, very interesting. Very, very, it rings true. In a way that, for me, I could not relate to the three friends. Except for Satya, whose pain is communicated in a very immediate way. And then the third, how do you write redemption, which is the allegory, which is Kannadeva Kannappa. That is redemption. How do you write it? And here I think that Gita has probably done the most inspired of the things by introducing song and poetry. It is an inspired use of both. And it is astonishing in its how should I put it, in its embrace, because here she lets her imagination get free play. She is not tethered to reality. She is not tethered to the factual stories of Satya, Ravi, and Asha, and she is not bound by the references to Kalburgi, Dabolkar, Gauri Lankesh, blah, blah, blah. She's not tethered to them. Here, her imagination runs free and it traverses everything, not just time and space, but form, content, voice, everything. And it's it's lyrical, and it's, Ranjit said hopeful. I agree, but I think it's much more than hopeful. It's redemptive. So this analogy of the 3-ply yarn, what is it made of? So is it 3 different yarns? And what should I say? Silk, cotton, wool, jute, flax, linen? I don't know. Maybe none of those. But whatever the 3-ply yarns are, it's a single story in 3 registers, a single story. It is a 3-ply yarn, of course, but there's another very strong image in the novel, and that is the image of the river, of water. That is, of course, the tide. It's in the title. But the immense possibilities of that image is strongest in the Kannadeva Kannappa story, where, of course, the river is the river he crosses, of course, all those symbolisms and etc. It's the lake around which Krishna and his friends walk. And so and it's also the lake where that awful statue of Kannadeva is, that hideous thing is going to be erected. But it's missing in Ravi, Satya, and Asha. And I think that this image, which is so present and so living in Kannadeva Kannappa, becomes a still lake in Krishna, and then almost disappears in the other 3.
Thank you so much, ma'am. So now, without taking much time, I would like to invite our third panelist, Sudhanva Deshpande, and let us know how an actor feels about how the book has been. So over to you,
Well,
sir.
thank you very much, Antara, and thank you for this invitation to be here this evening. It's been fantastic. It's been fantastic listening to both Ranjit and Ritu. I have learned a lot about the novel just listening to the two of them. I did, of course, read the novel when it first came out, and then again, reread it now as part of preparing for this evening. That's, in a sense, it seems to me that that's what really the novel is about. It's about the struggle to read. And it's a struggle to read at multiple levels, I think. One is just the physical struggle to read. In other words, when the story of Kannappa begins, they don't know how to read. He and the rest of them, Chikkiah, Mahadevi, and the rest of them, they don't know how to read and write. And through their narrative arc, they reach a point where not only do they learn to read, they also learn to write, and of course they've been creating. And so what they've been creating orally gets, in a sense, recorded through this act of reading and through this act of writing, which then enables Professor Krishna to read. And if Professor Krishna had not got hold of that manuscript, what would have been our understanding of Kannadeva? As well as, for instance, the struggle to read that Professor Krishna goes through. How does he then deconstruct this, deconstruct and reconstruct the evidence that he's finding from his reading? And his reading will always be based on evidence, on the manuscript that he's found, that he has got hold of. But it is a reading. And it is a reading that is already being challenged. It's being challenged in very dangerous ways in the story. But also it can be challenged in very productive ways. And so therefore there is that tension. As you see his reading being challenged in ways that are going to be dangerous for him, because you already know the story of the real life, of Professor Kalburgi, for instance. That's the image that kept coming to my mind, even more than Dabolkar or, Pansare or Gauri Lankesh. That has happened in real life around us in our time. And so his reading is going to be challenged from that very violent perspective. But also you do want to say, and you want to fight for that other way of reading, In other words, you do want to fight for creating conditions that would allow people to read and to contest readings, but not in this violent way, right? And that's what really would advance our understanding of history, of society, of culture, of literature, and so on and so forth. Then, of course, there's the other struggle of reading, which is the struggle that Asha, Ravi, and Satya go through. And that struggle then culminates, as it does. And there, of course, the association again with real life is so stark and so, it's so powerful, because Rohit Vemula again is a figure that, we all know. And just as one reads Krishna's story, one also reads this strand, knowing that there is a tragedy at the end of it, even if you don't know the story, the actual narrative, but you read it with a sense of foreboding. And so what is their struggle? Their struggle is literally to get educated, and the institutional blocks that they face because of their birth, and these institutional and societal blocks are preventing them from reading, and therefore also in the future writing, and so on. So there's this great deal of tension in the novel, throughout the novel, between reading and writing, and who's reading what, in what way, how are we reading what they're reading, and so on and so forth. So in one sense, it seems to me, and this was not a very strong sense when I first read the novel. The first time I read the novel, I was reading it more for the narrative, and there's a way in which, because that all of this history has happened in our time, therefore you don't want it to repeat itself in the novel. You kind of hope against hope that some miracle would happen, and these stories would not end in tragedy. But of course, you're being a fool. It is going to end in tragedy. If a modern poet today is told, for instance, that now you have to write poetry that can pass off as the poetry of, let's say, Kabir or Nanak or whoever, right? I mean, seriously, you expect me to write the way Kabir was writing, right? It's one thing to translate; it's another to create from scratch and create poetry that would pass the test of that kind of writing. And I think that Gita does that with great style and panache. And I have to say that I read those bits. The first time I read the book, I was totally caught up with those, and I was, enjoying the beauty of her creating a sort of a early medieval, or whatever historically, however one wants to name that period. I want to also think about the title of the book. I have become the tide. And because I wasn't very certain that I'd be able to articulate myself clearly if I were to just speak, I've actually written out something on this. And I also want to just take this opportunity to say it's a beautiful cover. And there's a cliche about not judging a book by its cover. I want to say, as a publisher, that we spend a lot of time, effort, energy, in designing covers. And why would we not want our book to be judged by its cover? There's some great sort of skill that goes into it, and so on. And I do want to doff my hat a little bit to Shoili, who's the designer of the cover, and to Gita, who I'm sure has had a huge role to play in the design of the cover. So, it's a beautiful sort of, it kind of engulfs the whole book. So let me just quickly read out a page or so. I have become the tide, 5 words. Your attention goes immediately to the last 2, the tide. What tide is this? Kannadeva's poetry refers repeatedly to a river, but rivers don't have tides, oceans do. This brings attention to the first word, I. I have become the tide. Who is this I who has become the tide? There's an immediate tension here. Generally, a tide brings to mind or refers to a multitude, not a single person. So who's this I? Is it Kannadeva and the characters around him? Is it Professor Krishna, who researches Kannadeva's poetry and the characters around him? Is it the young students Asha, Ravi, and Satya, whose lives are shaped by institutional and societal casteism? Or is it Satya alone who becomes one with the elements? Or is the I a collective? The collective that Asha is part of at the end of the novel, the procession. But let's not lose sight of the middle two words either. Have become. I have become the tide. So whoever it is that is the I, and whatever it is that the tide is, they were not that when the story began. Have become signals the culmination of a journey, not the beginning. In other words, the journey has changed that which was the I into the tide. Also, have become is the present tense. It is not had become, nor is it will become. It is have become. In part, this prepares us to read a novel, the entire narrative of which is written in the present tense. Now, parenthetically, I should say that there's a reason why not too many novels are written entirely in the present tense. It takes skill to pull it off, and Gita does it with quiet flourish. The question then is, who or what is it that has transformed as the novel progresses? All the characters have transformed, actually, if you think about it. Chikkiah, Mahadevi, Kannadeva, and their associates undergo a deep and fundamental transformation. So does Professor Krishna, and so do the students. And certainly not all transformations are peaceful. 3 of the protagonists will no longer be with us by the time the narrative ends. So, have these 3 become the tide? 3 characters separated by time and geography? Is this the tide of history then? But there's also another kind of transformation at work. The invisible author, the one who fashions the narrative and shapes it, she performs a little trick. One that is fraught with great danger, though. She helps us enter worlds that are not only far from ours, but also worlds that are far from hers. At one point in the novel, a character talks about layers of historical forgetting that have turned Kannadeva, that have turned Kannappa, a washerman's son and a cattle skinner's grandson, into a casteless Hindu saint, Kannadeva. What Gita Hariharan does in the novel is the opposite. She pulls off multiple layers of imaginings. So hers is an enterprise of imagining, as opposed to, or in contest with or struggling against this historical forgetting. We enter the world of Kannadeva centuries ago, but we also enter contemporary worlds that are distant from us. These contemporary worlds are not distant in terms of physical distance. In fact, these worlds surround us, but they are distant socially. Here, of course, I presume that most readers of the novel in English will be people of some privilege, even if limited. The lives that they feel from close up are of individuals, many of whom have virtually no privilege. Now, this is a difficult feat of imagination, to imagine and recreate the lives of those without privilege while being privileged oneself. It is also an act fraught with danger. I hardly need to remind us of the minefield that this is. And Gita Hariharan pulls off this courageous act of empathy, solidarity, and partisanship. And to me, that is the true triumph of this novel.
Thank you so much, Sudhanva Deshpande, for such a beautiful interpretation of taking us through the book's cover and everything. I mean, even how you have talked about the title and explained it so beautifully. So thank you so much, sir. Now, without wasting much time, I would like to invite our author, Gita Hariharan. But before that, I would like to give a brief introduction of our author. She is an author of novels, short stories, essays, newspaper articles, and columns. Her first novel, The Thousand Faces of Night, won the Commonwealth Writers' Prize for Best First Book in 1993. Now, with this, I would like to invite her. And in the very beginning, I remember the author telling us that today we have a set of panelists, which includes a poet, an editor, actor, we have a writer. So let's hear it from her, what she has to take us through her interpretation of what the panelists have just said. Over to you, ma'am.
I want to thank all of you for bringing the book back to me. I don't know what it's like for other writers, but for me, a book is never quite complete. It keeps coming back to you as like a gift. Sometimes not a gift you want, but from readers many years later who will even insist, for example, that you wrote one book before the other, even though you tell them, you assure them, no, this was not the order. So that ownership is very important. But thank you very much. And there's a great deal for me to respond to, which I think is more interesting than my holding forth about the book. But first, I want to ask myself, I wrote this book in a great rush of passion and imagination and sleeplessness over 2 years. I've never written a book as fast. And it was writerly hubris. For some reason, I was determined it should be published before the 2019 elections. I say writerly hubris because, as we will all admit, there's very little our books actually do in terms of political change. I think it has something else, but we will come to that later. But between the hardcover in 2019 and now the paperback, I ask myself the question, what does it mean not just to talk about this book, but to talk about any of our literary endeavor, what we have written, what we are reading? Because the only tenuous connection I can find is that in writing, I have become the tide, and the novel itself, once it is sort of leaving you, was obsessed with ways of expressing and exploring and questioning manifestations of inequality and imagining utopia where there is a little more equality briefly. So in between, in the last year and a half, we have seen how old dividing lines, old cracks can actually become huge, shifts of the ground. We've seen whether it is women, whether it is Dalits, whether it is Adivasis, whether it is workers, agricultural workers, the whole lot. You know that people who are traditionally forgotten, excluded, discriminated against, violence perpetrated against, this in the flare-up that we've seen, that is the chronic. But in the flare-up that we've seen of the COVID virus and a certain ideological government and bureaucracy taking care of people during the attack of this virus, what has happened? The public, in public health, in all the security nets have been torn apart. So in that sense, for me, the book lives in a strange and sad way because no writer would be able to imagine these horrors, I think. But let me also say, it is not just the divisions. It is also the crushing of dissent. When I was writing the book, I think it would be honest to admit that most of us these days are quite nervous when we are writing. And you have to almost tell yourself, no, don't be a scaredy cat. We'll see what happens. But it's important to acknowledge the fear because it's real. We all know enough people who are sitting in jail right now for what they believe in, what they've written, and so on. But I think it was hard to imagine that the crushing of, forget dissent, nothing as grand as that. Simply opening your mouths, raising your voice, speaking, sharing an opinion, sharing somebody else's opinion because you agree, we didn't think it would get this bad, but it has. And I can say this because this is affecting, if it's affecting all of us, the privileged, those with some, space in the public arena, we can only imagine what is happening to people with less privilege. So I want that background to be hanging there. So I'm not really equipped to talk about it, except as a citizen and as a writer. But I think I want that the virus, the multiple viruses that infect the air we breathe today, to be there in the background. I coming to the book itself, I loved some of the images and metaphors that all of you used, and I think it was absolutely spot on. I like the yarn. I was actually thinking as I wrote it, I absolutely love structure. So I was actually thinking of a tapestry, and there were some bits which I couldn't figure out, whether of language or whether, but it's very important to write in the failures as well. And I'll come to some of the failures all of you have kindly hinted at, because those were the threads that had to be left loose. I can't do it. I think it's very important. Writers are singularly equipped to say, I don't know. So those had to be left. Some of the knots had to be left there. But the challenge, of course, was to absolutely swim in this. I'm going to look at human situations, characters in the past and present, imaginary, taken, bits, hook in sort of little fish from reality, and see what I can say about equality and so on. Let me make some very specific responses. I think what I said about the pandemic was really a response to Ranjit, because he's talking about the continuous tension of being inclusive, of acknowledging our diversity, of celebrating our diversity, with the need to say difference, yes, diversity, yes, but equality, which is, of course, what our Constitution, very crudely, I'm summing up what our Constitution says. But some of the other points that you made, let me just come to what Sudhanva said about the poetry. For a prosaic person, of course, that's the first thing that you want to pick on. And I think there were multiple challenges of language in this book, because here was this completely bizarre exercise. Ritu mentioned that must be, or was it Sudhanva, that imagining how somebody wrote poetry a number of, thousands of years ago. But really, it was, how do you do that in English, for God's sake? And I've written books in English before. I've written short stories and novels in English before, but I've never suffered as I have with this book, because, the editor in your head is a very sharp creature. And to imagine how Chikkiah would have written in the 12th century and in English, for God's sake. Now, there, of course, the savior was the Vachana form, which really means what is spoken. So keep it as simple as possible, and simple, but it took a lot of hard work, even what they call the God. It took me weeks. I was discussing this with the Tamil translator of the novel Mangai, and she immediately understood. I said the word I had in mind is Tunaivan. Tunaivan in Tamil is very rich, because it means companion, but more than that. And companion is quite an ugly word in English. But it means somebody who comes with you. So when we were children and we visited the village and we were scared of going, to the backyard at night, and we'd say, come with me for Tonai. So it's somebody who walks with you, who shelters you. And very often in Carnatic kritis, Tonaivan is somebody who gives you shelter from the sun. So I wanted that kind of, but I couldn't find it in English. So, and I didn't want the usual Lord and so on, which sort of reminded me of Bharatanatyam performances when, they're doing a kind of translation in the beginning. So I decided on my friend. So there are some compromises you make and other people may not notice. But, to do that, I think the challenge was language. But more than imagining how Satya would write, it would be raw, it would be notes for the self. Chikkiah's would be much more hooked to nature and what is around him, and filled with images of not just nature, but workers as if they are part of nature, because the natural order of things, that sort of thing. But what I wanted to do, what occurred to me as I was writing the book, was, what is poetry? I wouldn't ask Ranjit this because his poetry doesn't need that question. But a lot of poetry on the streets, a lot of the poetry, like answers that came to me in 2019, the breakthroughs we saw, not just singing Faiz Hum Dekhenge, but the kind of poems, Hum Kagaz Nahi Dikhayenge, and some of the poems that became part of our day-to-day lives. I kept thinking, there's a little part in the novel when Satya says, but I don't even know if what I'm writing is poetry. And Ravi, who's much more confident and is part of an Ambedkarite group, says, who's anyone to tell you what poetry is? If you think it's poetry, it's poetry. So in a way, I was also asking myself, how do you de-high culture yourself? To not make it only this or that, but to be more inclusive in terms of learning to listen to other kinds of music, learning to truly enjoy it and understand it. So that was another motif that I was quite aware of. And Ritu, yes, in the story of Satya and Asha and Ravi, there isn't that much water, but there is the pond that Satya goes to and sits by. It's not quite the untouchable pond that Chikka begins with. This is a slightly better pond. It allows him to remember his mother in the fields. But this is also the pond in which he commits suicide. That's there. But right at the beginning, they see the sea. So really the thing is the hope of movement. And where do you shrink and come back to, so there's a lake and a brook and a stream and so on and so forth. And really, finally, the pattern was stillness and movement. And stillness could not only be a critique of stagnation, but also of empty spirituality. The sort of tranquility, these days during the lockdown, all of us are absolutely inundated with advice to meditate and, think of nothing and so on. So it is, in a way, a kind of empty tranquility where you forget other people, as if such a thing can be done, and only, look inward. The Krishna strand, I've always felt as a writer, how do I get into these lives, into these situations that I don't personally know? And of course, why bother writing if you're not going to take that risk? I remember in Fugitive Histories, when I was writing not about what happened in Gujarat in 2002, but that was at the core of it. Now, I'm not from Gujarat. I'm not Muslim. So who was I to write about this? And how was I not just going to write reportage in the crudest sense of the word? So I had to find a way, a fictional strategy to travel in there. I know what it is like to write, to be passionate about being allowed to write what I want, to edit, to struggle every day to find out what is the strange thing that is called truth, and how many windows you can open and how many versions you can see of it, and you have to reconcile all that. So that is a middle class place I know. Teaching, learning. And in a way, Sudhu put it wonderfully, that it's all about learning to read, but it's also teaching and learning. So learning to read, Mahadevi learning to write, because till then, the woman's always inscribed upon, and she becomes the inscriber. And she records not just her own, but curates. And then none of you picked up the terrible thing of not only my difficulty in writing in English, this particular novel, these particular characters, but that for Satya, Ravi, and Asha, one of the biggest difficulties is English. And the loneliness of being in one of those hostels where you might have two young people who don't speak English, but one speaks Hindi and one speaks Kannada. And the loneliness of that. So not only caste, but I think almost every student I spoke to said English was the biggest problem. And English was where they were mocked the most, left out the most, So I think these were sort of some of the exclusions and so on. But with the title, of course, the full poem in translation from J.V. Pawar's wonderful Marathi poem, which has been I've used the translation by Eleanor Zelliot and Jayant Karve. He actually says, I become the tide, and then there is, what happens next. I soar, and where this wave will go, and which no part of your edifice of orthodoxy and power and privilege will be exempt from where this tide will go. So that, of course, is such a powerful symbol of resistance, not just the tide and the rising, but that of movement, of change. So I think I should stop there.
Thank you so much, Gita, taking us across the whole narrative. So with this, I would like to invite our panelists for one-liners.
It's been absolutely marvelous to be here and to be part of this conversation and to hear all of these marvelous approaches to the novel. I hadn't responded as I had meant to the poetry that you've written. And I just want to say something about it in conclusion. Also to point to an underground river, if you will, that does nourish us when we come to such acts as this very courageous act you've undertaken. You said that you felt that there was nothing in English that you could use as a kind of model and so forth. But if I may just, have the temerity to contradict you on that. I think many of us, been nourished by a powerful tradition of translation, particularly from Kannada and Tamil and Telugu. I'm thinking here of Ramanujan, A.K. Ramanujan, but also of Hank Heifetz, Velcheru Narayan Rao, and David Shulman. And that's what comes through powerfully in a poem like this, which you attribute to Chikkiah. How you love green, Lord, raw in the fresh sprout, emerald on jasmine leaves, the rain tree with its distant coolness, all the balm of green, O river of 1,000 faces, the yellowing coconut fringe dangles dangerously. Is it time, my friend?
Gita saying that she had to struggle so much with language, and I think that is a very, very moving and a very, very honest and very, how should I put it? She made herself vulnerable by saying that, but it's true. And what to me is remarkable about what she managed to do is precisely what both Sudhanva and Ranjit have commented on, which is that in a strange way, in an unexpected way, she seems to have found her voice in the poetry. This is astonishing, and it's very wonderful for me. I know Gita's prose. I expect from her that fluency and elegance and so on. But I think that actually in this book, she found her voice in the poetry. This, to me, was the greatest surprise in the book. And I keep going back to that because, as I said, it is the voice that reaches out. And I mean, it was for me the delight of discovery. So congratulations, Gita, on that.
See, apart from being a publisher and a theatre director and whatever, I'm also an actor. And so as part of my acting life, I watch a lot of films and web series and so on and so forth. And it's interesting that, and I've also had occasion to act in a few. And so, one gets into conversations with people who create these things sometimes. And I've been struck in these conversations about how they're fantastic storytellers. They're really talented storytellers, many of them. And you get a sense that they are feeling like there's a jail in which they've been imprisoned, or they are being, strangulated more and more. And so, there are horrible things happening all around us. There's so much violence, there's so much hatred, there's so much this, that, all the rest of it. It feels like, everything is dark, and, there's no escape from this darkness. And I'm afraid that reflects in the work that they create. They're very good at telling us, these are the things that are broken, these are the things that are wrong, these are the things that are, dark, and so on and so forth. But there's very little I find in cinema and that space where you get a sense of that. No, that's not the end of the story. There's some escape from this as well, and the idea of solidarity. Empathy is something that they talk about a lot, and in particular, you are told as an actor, you're told all the time that you are going to help people empathize with your character. Even if it's a negative character, even if that character is doing horrible things and so on and so forth. But your skill as an actor is going to help people empathize with them, even if not, identify or sympathize or, approve and so on. You don't have to like the character. You just need to empathize with the character and so on. So empathy is something that they talk about a lot, but I never hear them talking about solidarity. Never. Nobody talks about solidarity. And this book is a book of solidarity. It's a book of hope. It's a book of imagining, an escape, but really to be able to break out of the chains that we are in that sense, an escape, as a positive act, and so I really want to say that, that for me is also an act of courage. Because it takes a special kind of courage to say that that we are in a really dark phase right now, but we will get through it, and there's that belief. The last thing I want to say quickly is that I had written it, and since Antara had said that we have to do a one-line thing at the end, I had saved it for that, but now Gita has already spoken so eloquently about it. But I just wanted to say in one line that this is a vernacular novel accidentally written in English. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sudhanva. Now moving to Gita, what you have to add to all their comments?
I want to make quickly 2 or 3 points. It's better for a writer not to talk too much about the novel. It's enough to write the novel and let it wander off. Just as it's hard to let go of one's children, it can get hard to let go of your novel, but you should. So one is in response to what Ranjit reminded me, yes, of course, without those translations, A.K. Ramanujan in particular, where would we be? I was all of 17 when in college in Bombay, in Sophia College, and there was a little lane. We went down the hill, the Holy of Holies, with all these girls locked up there. And we went down, and there was a little hole-in-the-wall bookshop which really should be declared a deemed university. I don't know if it's still there. But a friend of mine found Speaking of Shiva there. So for this ignorant 17-year-old allegedly studying English literature, this was, a huge awakening. And that book has traveled with me for decades and decades. And there's no point telling Antara how old we are, Ritu, you and I. So yes, it gains more and more meaning, actually, as you link it with not just the world around you, but with yourself. And I do want to, on that note, I want to emphasize that there are certain footnotes to this novel that I have been experiencing, which is that no writer writes because you have answers. In fact, you write because you don't, I think. And so I'm not exempt from, I don't think I'm evil, such as the killers in this novel, but it is a lifelong exercise for those who are discriminated against to shed their diffidence and fear and destructive anger, and keep the good anger. It's not something you just learn. It's a work in progress. So similarly, I think every day, how do you re-understand and let that alter your behavior? So I think those footnotes are there and now we see in the light of the pandemic, other aspects of it. So that is something else. But finally, what I want to say is that I must smile now, because once I got a letter from a reader saying, I heard you speak somewhere and you were so cheerful and you laugh so often, why do you write such gloomy novels? So of course I wrote back saying, good thing too, because, if I wrote cheerful novels and were gloomy in real life, that would be very sad. But no, I want to say that while there's darkness, as there is in real life, while there's cruelty, there's hatred, there's discrimination, there's violence, all of it, which all of us know unless we are blind and deaf. But I think I see, and so the novel sees, beauty on the one hand, and then the bravery of resistance. I think all of us know in these times, we see every day how amazingly brave the most unlikely people are. So what is courage is a question, I think, that was asked during the emergency, and it's asked again now. It's ordinary people suddenly saying, no, you can't do this. I'm a citizen, I'm going to express myself, and I'm going to resist. There's no other way for us but to become the tide together.
I, as a reader, would just like to add that this book is a must read for any reader across disciplines. And I would seriously like to thank all of you to take your time out of your busy schedules and adding a twist on this novel from your own angles. So thank you so much for being with us. And from Galplok team, I would like to thank all of you again.